Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning into Health Podcast Show, the place to be to get the insights of leaders working at the intersection of health, science, and media. I'm your host, Dan Kendall, and this episode features a recording from the 2025 Health Podcast Summit, which was held on October 1st and 2nd. In total, we interviewed 42 speakers in 37 sessions that span topics across health, science, policy, and podcasting. You can wait to get access to all the sessions as we publish them here on your favorite platform, or you can get access to all the recordings, links, and resources by visiting our website at healthpodcast.org. Again, that's healthpodcast.org. Enjoy the show. Welcome to this session of Health Podcast Summit 2025. I'm your host, Dan Kendall. Our next session features two guests, Dan Kendall from UK-based production company The Podcast Guys, and Sejal Patel from Insulet, the medical device company that makes the Omnipod brand of insulin pump. Through their collaboration, Dan and Sejal have grown the Insulet-branded podcast from a tiny corner of a trade show booth to a podcast with over 100,000 downloads. The podcast is entitled Beyond the Bolus, and you can find a link to it in the description below. In this session, they reveal how recording at conferences captures thought leaders when they're already on site, making 30-minute commitments achievable. They also share why having medical team members present during recordings enables real-time corrections instead of lengthy medical, legal, and regulatory reviews. And we also discuss how creating a bit of a show at their conference booths with lights, cameras, and even silent disco headphones generates buzz that extends beyond the conference floor. I'd like to take a moment to thank all our sponsors and partners who make Health Podcast Summit 2025 possible. A special thanks to our gold sponsor, BetterHelp, and to our silver sponsor, ZS. Please visit healthpodcastsummit.com for links to all these organizations and special offers. Now let's turn to our conversation with Dan Kendall and Sejal Patel. Sejal Patel, Dan Kendall, thank you so much for joining me here at Health Podcast Summit.
Hi, Dan. Good to be here. Thanks.
Sage, I want to start with you. I want to dive right in here because I'm really curious about your podcast that you've created there at Insulet. Insulet's a very popular pump. It's very popular in my family, I know. My oldest daughter has type 1 diabetes and is a user of the Omnipod 5. So I was really excited to understand some of your marketing strategy and how you're positioning this product overall. So I was hoping you could take us back about 4 years ago when you actually started the podcast. What were some of the things that you were working to address? What were some of the challenges that you were facing that you thought creating a podcast could help you solve those?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love to hear that your daughter is a podder. That makes me happy. So going back several years, at the time, we were relying pretty heavily on traditional channels like long form, really didactic, slide heavy content. And I remember thinking HCPs are incredibly busy. They're constantly absorbing information and they don't always have the time or energy for dense content. And I thought we needed to meet them where they are with something engaging, digestible, and relevant. And podcasts felt like the perfect fit. I use them in my personal life and I just saw the value in them. They offer short form content that's informative, but also entertaining. And they allow HCPs to listen on their own terms, whether they're commuting to work, walking, taking a break, what have you. And so it was a bit of a leap at the time, but I really trusted that the quality and value would be there and then the format would resonate.
It's very different in medical device marketing. I come from a medical device background myself. I carried a sales bag for Stryker for a number of years and worked in marketing out there actually in California, in San Diego and San Jose. And we created, to tell you, give you a little flashback about my age and longevity here, we actually burned a CD for our sales reps back in 2002, I think it was, to distribute information about one of our new products. And I know medical marketing can be a little bit behind in terms of embracing new technologies. I also remember having conversations around that same time, 2002, 2003, about whether we needed a website or a web page about new products, because there was a debate about whether we should put this stuff available freely on the web, which is kind of crazy in today's view. So when you were thinking about this, you were using it in your personal life. There was another thing that was going on 4 years ago, this little pandemic that sort of transformed the way we were all working and living. So was that a factor in your decision making as well in terms of how you were actually able to connect with your target audience?
Absolutely. We were looking for diversifying ways to reach them, but it was also just after the pandemic. And so people were really seeking connection. And that's what kind of prompted us to launch this at an event at a conference, the American Diabetes Association conference, which is our biggest event of the year. And we just felt like people seeing it and it being tangible would help just create momentum around it. And create that in-person connection, but then it had the longevity of, people being able to listen well beyond the time that we were there. So definitely.
I want to bring Dan in just a second, but before I do that, can you just give me an idea of about how you went about developing this idea? Because 4 years ago is a blink of an eye, but also we've seen a huge amount of growth in podcasting, particularly in health podcasting. So you were pretty early in that curve. How did you actually go about finding information? There was no health podcast summit for you to tune into to learn from people like yourself. So how did you go about putting together a strategy that led you even to find Dan and his group, the Podcast Guys?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I do wish that I had some resource like this back then because I had to get really scrappy and resourceful. So it's funny how I found Dan. I met him through a different Dan that I had worked with. It was this thing called ADA TV, and it was this production that we did in partnership with ADA the year before. And when I thought of doing a podcast, I thought, production people know each other. Maybe he knows someone that does podcasts. And so he recommended Dan. And I just immediately enjoyed speaking to Dan. And I knew that he was so well versed in this category. Like he had been doing it well before it became popular. And so I just had this immediate sense of trust the more and more that we talked. And so that was like one really pivotal step for me. The other one was finding the right hosts for the podcast. There were a lot of options. I didn't feel like I was the right person for it, but we did a lot of internal headhunting and we found this really dynamic duo in Nancy Hanna and Dina Gottesman. I just have to give them a shout out because they're the heart of the podcast. And I feel like they are a huge part of the success.
So you had a cheat code. We Dans like to stick together. So you had a Dan before Dan, and now we're here with two Dans. So you had a cheat code. So Dan, I mean, that is pretty fortunate that you happen to know a person who introduced you to the person you ended up working with. You didn't have to go through and get 3 quotes or try to contact a bunch of, entertainment podcasters and try to convince them of what, explain what you're doing. You happen to stumble across somebody who really knows what they're doing.
Yeah. And honestly, before that, I had actually just done like cold searches online for different agencies. And I had other people recommend different agencies, but I met them all and I just could tell they didn't have the expertise in the area. It was like something they were dabbling in, but they didn't actually know how to make a podcast that sounds engaging. It was just like another information channel to them versus I feel like Dan understands it and he makes it interesting and like brings fresh angles and just has that like subject matter expertise.
Brilliant. So Dan, let's bring you in now. So when Sage contacted you, what was the sort of state of the project? What were some of the ideas that she approached you about?
Well, I'm kind of blushing now, Sage. So thank you so much for those nice words that you said about me.
Look, you match the background. It's perfect.
absolutely. My pink background. Look, I also really enjoyed the conversation with Sage when she got in contact with us because, I speak to so many different brands across many levels of organizations and marketing in particular. And a lot of people come to us and say, I really want to start a podcast because the CEO said, right? Or I really want to start a podcast because everyone else is doing it. And then you kind of have to spend a lot of time with them, helping them to develop the idea, which is fine. But Sage came to us with the idea much more thought out than that. Nobody in the organization had told her to do it. She wasn't doing it because, her competitors were doing it. She wanted to really lead from the front. and the idea was absolutely all hers. And so that was really, really helpful. It was really helpful to kind of get that download of what her vision was for this particular podcast. And then through, the conversations that we went on to have, really understand the target audience. So who do we want to listen to this podcast? More importantly, what do we want that audience to do once they've listened to that podcast? And then how can we create content that's going to really speak to that particular audience? And how do we get the production value out of that? And of course, 4 years ago, as Sage said, we were just coming out of this pandemic. And at the time, around sort of 85, 90% of the productions that we were involved with were very much remote. They were using platforms like this on Riverside to record those conversations. But there was a real sense of, can we get back in person, get to some of these events and do something a little bit different? And that's why, for me, it was super exciting to be able to collaborate with Sage and the Insulet team to get there to that conference, do something a little bit different with podcasting for this debut podcast, not just different for Insulet, but different to this industry. And through those conversations, I was really glad that we were able to bring it to life for that first one in New Orleans.
I definitely want to talk more about that event context, because we do have some other sessions here at the summit where we talk about bringing podcasts into events and the usefulness of this. I want to flip back over to you, Sage, and just try to understand. Dan talked about the target audience. Can you describe the target audience and maybe give us a little bit of an idea about the idea you landed upon and whether that's changed or morphed in any way since you've been doing it now for 4 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So, our target audience is healthcare professionals in the diabetes space. And this was actually one of the reasons that I wanted to do this podcast, is because I recognized that there were a lot of diabetes related podcasts tailored to patients. And there weren't any for providers. And I'm like, HCPs are humans as well. They want to be engaged, they want content to be compelling. There could be humor in there. They're not stiff. So that was part of it. And the way it's evolved over time is, initially it was very much about the HCP, and now it's become about more than that. Patients might listen to it. Internal people might listen to it. Our sales force definitely listens to it because it's a conversation starter when they approach HCPs as well. And so it's become a lot broader, and we've actually been able to extend it beyond the US. So now our international marketing counterparts have their own podcast, and we collaborate on that as well. So it's just been this really incredible journey. And we've also had the opportunity to work with our partners at Dexcom on an episode. And so it's kind of just exploded for much more beyond what I ever imagined. And that's just been the beauty of it.
That is terrific to hear. I honestly, I didn't have any background about what you were going to share on this conversation. So that is so wonderful to hear that you've had such a positive experience with it. Going back again 4 years ago, this was a very new concept. Dan's been doing it for a while, since 2007. He's been creating podcasts. But how did you actually sell this internally inside your organization? You needed budget. You needed a medical, legal, regulatory process and framework. You needed buy-in. You pay some of your guests, or some of the guests that you have been paid. So you need to obviously disclose that in accordance with all the regulatory and ethical concerns and things. So how did you begin to take on all those internal challenges that actually can really delay and prevent, I think, a lot of people from taking on the opportunity that you're now benefiting from?
I really was determined to not let any of that stop me, because I just knew that if it worked, it could be amazing. And so I really just didn't want any of the logistics to be the limiting factor. Like, I started with that mindset. So I think that helped a lot. But I'm also really fortunate because I work somewhere where this entrepreneurial mindset is really celebrated and encouraged. And they want us to be creative and think out of the box and be disruptive. And so I didn't have such a hard time in the selling of it. I think it was more in like, what are all of the steps involved in actually making this happen? And so it was just moment by moment tackling each thing as it came and getting people bought into the idea before getting into here's what I need from you and here's all the questions I have for you. It was more like, let me sell them on why this is going to matter and how it will also help them achieve their goals.
There's obviously a lot that Sage needs to manage inside of her organization in terms of her hosts, her budget, her booth schedule, the booth placement, and things like that. Dan, how do you get involved, and what are some of the things that you try to alleviate as concerns to try to get some of the logistics and pieces in place? Maybe you could just actually start off by explaining what it is that you actually do when you do set these up at these events.
Yeah, I mean, look, the first thing to say is that these events represent an amazing opportunity from a marketing perspective of the podcast for sure, but also a great opportunity to capture some crucial content that you may not be able to get outside of the conference. So to give you an example of that is, with some of those key events like ADA or EASD in Europe, you've got some of the most high profile, influential healthcare practitioners that are traveling to those events to be at those events, and these are really busy people that ordinarily it's very difficult to get onto their calendar, right? So there's this opportunity over a 3-4 day conference to reach out to them and say, hey, we'd love to discuss with you about a particular topic. We'd love your insight. We really love what you have to say about it. And we'd love you to invite you to our podcast recording area on our stand. And it makes it quite an easy yes, because really they're already on site. They just need to take 30 minutes out of their day and come and have this conversation with us and benefit from all the marketing activity that happens afterwards. So we spend a lot of time in the lead up to the event, really understanding what the run of show is going to look like, who we want to talk to, between Sage and her colleagues, who they really want to speak to about the topics that they've got going on at the moment, and they've got a great idea usually of who that is. And then we'll support by reaching out to them, having preparation calls with them and the hosts alongside Sage, and then building episode frameworks so that we have that run of show and we understand, the line of questioning that's going to happen, or the guest understands that line of questioning. Obviously, we record it once we're on site, and then we handle all of the post-production, the editing, the marketing activity, the shorts, those 30, 60, 90-second clips that can be sent and used as marketing activity to drive people to the long form content. And we get everything ready for that MLR process, which it needs to go into. So we've perfected that now over the past 4 years to really set a framework and a workflow, so that we can package all of that up and give everything all in one go for one MLR submission, for easy and quicker approval than it was 4 years ago.
Excellent. And Sage, is there anything you'd like to add to that process from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all know in healthcare, MLR can be a challenge, especially with something like podcasts that are so fluid. I mean, you can't be sure of what anyone will say. So it's just fluid and dynamic. And so one additional step that we have taken that has helped tremendously is to involve our medical counterpart. And so someone from medical is typically there during the recording. And so if something is said that we don't feel comfortable with, then they can flag it immediately and we can kind of do a retake. And so that hugely helps, because then we don't have to deal with it post-production. We can just deal with it in real time.
Yeah, we actually have quite a diabetes theme here at the summit. We have Danica the Diabetic, Danica Collins, who's been on talking about her podcast and omni-channel marketing. We have Stacy Sims, who does both diabetes connections for type 1 as well as for type 2 diabetes. We also just interviewed Chris Kohler from the American Diabetes Association, who's responsible for their podcast there as well as all their publishing. So you can see that I have a bit of a bias towards the diabetes topic and the work that people like you are doing to get this information out there. I'm really grateful for what you're doing. And I agree with the things you were saying earlier in the conversation stage in terms of the fact that people working in healthcare are so time poor, and the information that they need to consume and stay up to date with is huge because they are literally being tested, every 15 minutes by every new patient that comes in with something new that they may have just heard on NPR on the drive in. So
hmm
being able to stay up to date with all the literature and all the different product announcements and techniques about workarounds. I agree fully with what you were saying there in terms of how valuable this can be for healthcare professionals. How did you launch it? What was the actual push, and how was the reception?
Yeah. So when we had some episodes that we already planned for this conference at ADA. And then what we did is we had these like microphones. They looked like microphones, but they were a little flyer type collateral that we used to promote it on site at the conference. And people found out about it that way. They found out about it by stopping in their tracks when they saw the booth. So that generated a lot of interest. But once we actually had the episodes, we had this whole digital campaign to promote it via email, social, what have you. And Dan has definitely helped us to elevate our marketing of the podcast since then. So we're a lot more sophisticated now. He's helping us make podcasts and little teasers of the content that we produce. And I feel like that has really helped us to kind of hook people and then get them to want to listen to more. Our sales force was a huge part of the promotion as well. We informed them of the content and the speakers and got them to have conversations with HCPs about it to make sure that this was being listened to by the right people, like the intended audience, right? So they were a huge part of it as well. And then people just got really excited about it internally, started posting about it, and then it just becomes this like feed that just, keeps compounding.
I want to double click on the aspect of the sales rep because I was a sales rep for a medical device company. That interaction between the HCP and the sales rep is an extraordinarily expensive proposition for an organization to maintain. The training, the selection, the recruitment, all the sorts of things that keep the sales teams fortified and ready to go out and have that contact. And we know that you're dealing with a customer base that really has a lot of other things that are pulling on their attention. And that's one of the things that I think is so beautiful, which is why 22 years ago, we burned a CD for our sales team so they could stay informed while they were driving. And now I'm really pleased that organizations like yours are leading the use of podcasts to educate. Are you doing sort of leave behinds, or are the sales? I can imagine if I was a sales rep with an asset like this, I'd be wanting to hand out postcards and say, "Doctor, I know you're really busy," or to the nurse or diabetes educator, "I know you're really really swamped, but if you could just scan this QR code and listen to this on your drive home. This is Dr. Susan whomever, and she's talking about this." That seems like a really powerful way to sort of time shift and build that relationship and trust into the person's commute as opposed to between patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was this leave behind that is shaped like a microphone. And I think it's been really good because it immediately tells you what this is about, right? Versus like a piece of paper. And so I think the die cut of the microphone has been just a creative way to get that recognition of what you're giving me, right? Because they get handed pieces of paper all day long. And so that has been really effective when the HCP doesn't have time to have a conversation. It's like, here you go, scan the QR code, and off you go. And it's on all the streaming platforms you already use in your day to day life. Subscribe. And so that's been really powerful. Something else that I forgot to mention is our hosts are salespeople themselves, and so that's been huge because they have that influence with their peers. And so even when you think about how do I get the sales force to understand the value of this, they have been huge in just selling this to the rest of their peers.
And they're great personalities, aren't they, Sage?
They,
They're like, yeah.
they are.
Nancy, Nancy and Dina.
They're so much
You
fun.
have to have a great personality if you're going to be a sales rep out there representing your organization. So it would make sense that would translate into podcast experience. Not everyone can do that jump, but yeah, that's great to see that you've actually incorporated your sales team, which I think really helps the sales force understand, feel like they're represented in some of these interactions. So Dan, Sage just mentioned a couple times around distribution and the clips and things. So what are you doing? What are some of the resources or tricks or tips and things that you're doing to help make sure that this is out there and attracting the eyeballs that will turn into eardrums?
Well, look, gone are the days now where you can just, record a podcast, create a series of shows and then just put them out and kind of hope for the best. That doesn't work anymore. And particularly in the branded podcast space, there are, other podcasts that appear from competitors all of the time. And you need to have a strategy, just like any kind of marketing activation or any marketing channel. You have to have a strategy for that marketing. And that's something that we recognize. We have an audience development team now that work with all of our clients, including Insulet on Beyond the Bolus, to put together a marketing strategy to support, as an extension really of the marketing team, that really truly understand podcast marketing specifically, that specific channel. So our audience development director, led by Katrin, has been solely focused on podcast marketing since 2019, only that channel, and there's nothing she doesn't know about podcasting, essentially. So she works with the clients on helping to build out those strategies. And then, of course, it does feed back into the production because, from the conversations that we have, some of those key pivotal moments of the conversation, we really want to clip up and serve back to our intended audience, our target audience, on some of the other channels, the other marketing channels that are available where those audiences are, right? So LinkedIn, newsletters, might be Instagram for some brands, TikTok for some brands, wherever that audience is showing up, we need to be able to clip up that content, clip up that relevant content, and serve it back to them in a way that's going to really resonate with them. And for HCPs, that's obviously things that are playing heavily on their mind, keeping them awake at night. How can we help them? How can we crystallize that we could help them solve a particular problem that they might be having in 20, 30 seconds in a clip, and drive them to that long form podcast, essentially. And that's our job to do that alongside Insulet with every episode we put out.
So Dan, I want to stay with you for a second, and I'll flip back over to Sage around this same topic. But one of the things I love about what you're doing is you are recording there on site. So you talked about during the pandemic, you, like everyone, were doing things very remotely. But then as you were coming out of the pandemic, that's when this podcast kicked off. You were able to do what you do have done a lot of, which is on-site recording. And you're leveraging the space at the exhibit hall. And I really want to drive this home to the audience because, folks, organizations, med device companies, pharma companies, they go to these meetings and they spend tens and tens of millions of dollars to get to these spaces. The equipment, the booth space, the sponsorship, the sales team, the marketing team, the flights, the hotels, the meals, the entertainment, the education sessions, the brochures, huge amounts of resource to hope that you encounter the people that you want to reach in those 2.5 or 3 days that you're actually there on the exhibition floor. And you also have to hope that the person who knows that doctor or knows that nurse and can attract their attention is there at the precise moment that person comes over and asks for them. So there's a lot of hoping going on. But what you do is you help give some additional certainty to that investment. And you also shift what's happening there on the exhibition floor and the thought leaders that are attending, and you shift that outside of the walls of that center, whether it's in New Orleans or San Diego or Boston, and you're able to then share that not just for 362 other days of the year, but for years to come. So I can imagine new sales reps that are coming on board with Insulet, they have a catalog of content that they can go back and listen to as they're driving between hospitals or pharmacies. So I really want you to share a little bit more about that approach and how powerful that is in being able to create content that really lasts.
100%. I think I said earlier that when I first started talking to Sage and we were coming out of the pandemic, or probably just about still in it, 85, 90% of our recordings were done on platforms like this on Riverside. I would suggest now, with the work that we do, 70% of our recordings are in person, which is so good to see, right? Because you're taking a podcast on the road. We're all humans. We crave that human interaction. And the great thing about taking the podcast on the road is that you get to keep the conversation going for longer. And one of the things that we always try and do, and obviously, brands like Insulet and the products and services that they provide do evolve, and they continue to improve and with innovation and technology. So you need to keep having these conversations, but we do try and focus on creating evergreen content so we can indeed keep that conversation going for longer. I think one of the really nice things, and one of the reasons I love working with Sage and the Insulet team, is because they're always pushing forward, right? So I remember, do you remember this, Sage? You obviously remember back in New Orleans when we first did the first one. Anyone that's been to one of these conferences you can't miss the Omnipod booth, from Insulet. It's huge. And we were given a tiny corner. Do you remember this? Of the booth on a table that was probably used for something else, like coffee or something like that. We set up some microphones around, and we just had some stools. We made the best of what we had, and we got this pilot going. We got our first few episodes recorded, and we got them out, and it was starting to get noticed, around the Insulet team, and it was starting to get noticed. It created a little bit of this buzz. And then we went to the next event and the next event. And if you come to any one of these shows now and you go to an Omnipod booth, there's a whole corner dedicated to podcasts. It's a studio within the booth, and there's more theater now all of the time. So we've got the chairs, we've got the mics all set up, we've got a green living wall. We have a dedicated space where people can stand and watch. We have those silent disco headphones. If anyone's ever been to a silent disco, people can put those on and listen to the podcast going out as live. It's only live once, right? It's only live once. So it's a good opportunity for them to listen. They can get all of the outtakes and everything in real time, because once that's recording stopped, it will obviously go to the edit, go through MLR, and it'll be published. The edited version will be published. But there's a real opportunity to create theater within the event, in real time, and by dedicating a portion of the booth, which Insulet have done and continue to do, that's one of the reasons I love working with Insulet.
It's really quite a spectacle there. I'm glad you brought up the silent discos headphones, because I've seen people stop. I've been one of the people that stop and put on the headphones and listen in. It really does create a spectacle at that event. You've got the lights, you've got the cameras, you've got the microphones, the headphones, the whole thing, and it does keep things going. Sage, anything you want to add about, from your perspective, what that does to your internal team and to your external relations?
Yeah, it just establishes us as creative and out of the box. And I think people really get behind that internally. They feel that energy. There's like buzz around the booth. And so people stop in their tracks to see what we're doing. And Dan mentioned something really important, which is evergreen content, right? There's a ton of investment. I completely appreciate what you were outlining with everything that goes into these conferences. It takes half a year to plan these conferences, especially our big ones. And so there's hope going into it. But what we try to do is really make sure that we have some control over the output, and we do a lot of planning so that when we're there, we know who's there, we know who we're speaking to, and then using that content as a feed over several months to buy us that runway. And for whoever's not there, I think it's important too that it kind of takes you back or brings you to that moment. So when I think about New Orleans and that first podcast, one of our episodes comes to mind. It was called "Will Bolus for Beignets?" And we tried to have fun with it, play on the theme of where we are at the time. And people have fear of missing out. And so they can kind of, if they can't attend, they can listen to that and feel like they were part of it. They were there. They got the insights from the show floor. And so it just, even for those that can't be there live, it just seeing the imagery, hearing us from that place, making references to that place, it just helps them feel connected. And I think that's important.
As many great people that fit into these conferences that can attend, there's simply more of them that can't be there, whether it's travel constraints or family obligations or budgets or just time. There's a lot of people who can't be there, and I love that you're taking this and putting that out there. And I know a lot of people who are listening or watching this might be thinking, what about sound quality? These booths can be loud. Let me tell you, I've listened to the podcast, I've seen the production. They still have great sound quality that they're able to do there with the quality of the microphones, proximity of the microphones, and then sound processing that Dan and his team bring to this. So don't let that be a concern. But there's another thing that I'm gonna let you off the hook here. I don't want to get into the details too much. I know there's going to be limits about what you want to share, but I know a lot of people who are listening to this would be wondering about what is the investment for this. And what I love about this is that you haven't starved this of oxygen. I've seen so many organizations that just dabble in, whether it was app development, 15 years ago, or now podcast development. They just give it a little bit of a budget and resource and time for someone like yourself, Sage, to just let it sort of strangle itself and die softly because it doesn't have the fuel that it actually needs to burn to be able to get the traction. So can you give any sort of picture without divulging all the confidentiality or anything that you prefer not to? Can you give any sort of idea of how this investment of this digital platform compares to your exhibit budget or your travel budget or your print budget, anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the value is there. Especially when we were piloting it, I didn't feel like the pilot was such a big investment that it deterred me. And then once we had the proof of concept based on the pilot, it became very easy to justify the spend. And so if leadership is like, is the ROI there? What is the ROI? I always want to reframe the conversation around, this isn't a quick hit type of channel, right? It's about long-term investment in trust and credibility and being part of the conversation and a leader in the space. And so I would advise people to start with the why and reframe the conversation when you're trying to talk about ROI. And it's about educating HCPs, right? And staying relevant and set phased expectations. Early, it's about engagement and feedback. And then over time, you can show how the content is being used across channels and driving deeper connections. And so something else too is, this channel has allowed us to have conversations with thought leaders, key opinion leaders in the space that otherwise may not talk to us. And so it's just open doors that are otherwise closed.
Yeah, it's such a good point on opening up conversations with people that you don't ordinarily get to speak to. That's a reason why many of our clients now choose to start a podcast. And how do you put the value on that, right? That's a difficult one to put a number on, depending on who it is. But you've almost got an excuse to talk to that person when you invite them onto your podcast. I'm pretty clear with any brand that comes to talk to me about investment in podcasting. It is a long tail marketing strategy. If you're using it for marketing, it's not something whereby you should maybe do it for 3 episodes and see if it's going to work. That's not going to work. I do think there should be a pilot phase and a proof of concept for sure. But when we're building out the format and the strategy of the show, we should be thinking long term and costing it out long term, because if you want to get a ton of people to see a piece of content or see a new product or service that you're offering very, very quickly, then just go and spend a ton of money on Google Ads and you'll get those people very quickly, but they won't be there long term. If you want to build a relationship with an audience and you want to build a community and you want people to spend time with your brand, 30 minutes, 45 minutes to an hour, listening to every episode of your podcast over the course of 12 months, then you've got a very different relationship with that listener because they're more invested. They feel like they know you more. They've got an affinity and a relationship with the hosts that are fronting your podcast. And so that brand affinity that they've got, and hopefully that recall when the need for your product or service comes, is the podcast that they've been listening to for the past 12 months, 2 years, and you're the brand that they're going to resonate with. Again, how do you put a value on that? So, it is something that should be considered as a long-term channel investment, and also the fact that it does get to feed these other marketing channels as well. You could almost put podcasting kind of at the center as a central pillar that then feeds your social media, your YouTube, your newsletter content, as well as the podcast channels as well.
It's something we've talked about in other sessions here on Health Podcast Summit in terms of the value of what you just raised there, Dan, in terms of the places and spaces where people are consuming and engaging with these brands. These are very intimate places where you only spend time with your family and friends. You're going in the car with people, you're going to the gym, you're cooking dinner with them, you're spending time with them in their homes, and that affinity of them spending time in their home or in their car listening about your brand and being fed information that they can use, you're helping them transform from a point where they didn't have this information to a point where they do. So it's really providing a real service and keeping your audience at the center of what it is you're trying to do. So thanks for bringing that up around listen time, because this isn't just about downloads. You can fake downloads, you can drive downloads, but it's really around what about that 15-minute podcast? What about that 30-minute podcast that you're spending time in the ears of someone that's engaged with your, and they've opted in. They're not driving by a billboard. They're not happening to see your video at the start of a movie. They've elected with their fingertip to consume that content, and now you're able to continue that engagement. So as you can tell, I'm a huge fan of what you guys are doing, and I want the audience to go out there and contact Dan, learn from Sage, and find out how they can do more of this themselves, because I think this is a great solution. Anything you want to say on that as we wrap up here?
Well, thanks, Dan. I think if we talk about milestones, though, I think most brands do see downloads as milestones. There's obviously far more milestones and metrics that I look at with my team, and also in association with Sage and her team around listen length. How long are people listening for? Is the content really relevant? The demographics of the people listening. But downloads is still a metric that we should get excited about. And Sage, we've had some great reasons to get excited about the milestones for Beyond the Bolus recently, haven't we?
We have surpassed 100K downloads, which I remember when we kicked this off, I was just thinking, like, I can't wait for the day that we reach 100K. And so I'm just over the moon to see that. And for people to approach us and be like, I love your podcast, like, there is no greater testament than that when it comes up on its own organically. And yeah, I'm just so proud of the team.
I just want to provide two other insights for the audience, and maybe this is something you guys are already thinking about. Number one is around the use of audio as a mini series. You are going to have people, all of us, everyone working in healthcare, are going to have people who are new to a product, in the case of Insulet with the Omnipod, or a condition or disease state, or their training. And going to 4 seasons of podcasts is really hard. I know when my daughter was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, I wasn't ready to listen to episode 187 about somebody who climbed Kilimanjaro and kept her insulin from freezing. I was still just trying to get her home from the hospital, and I didn't even understand fully what insulin was and why it would freeze. So so the idea of creating a mini series out of this bulk of content, maybe having that as a side from your 4 seasons, and having a quick 10 episode series that people can download, so they don't have to, they can find the best of each episode, or the key things they need in their learning journey. That's just one idea I want to throw out to you. Then another thing I want the audience to think about is once you've created this asset, you can make this work for you in terms of dynamic advertising. I know that Insulet goes out to the European meetings and US meetings all over the place. So being able to use that asset where people are already downloading it in their locations, you can have dynamic ad insertion that airs differently in Europe than it does in the US. And you can tell people, come by booth 4553 because we're recording our next version of our ADCES or ADA or whatever it is event. And you can have a different ad that plays in Europe that says, hey, we're going to be in Vienna on these dates. Come by and see us. Or we have an education session starting at 8:30. Come by and see us in whatever room. So using that asset. So those are just a couple of different aspects of how you can take the investment that an organization like Insulet is making and educating health professionals through podcasts, and then transferring even to more knowledge, more value for the person who's decided to vote with their fingertip to consume that information. So on that note, let's finish up with a question about advice that you would have, Sage and Dan, for people who are considering this, besides walk, don't run to your to the ability to start creating podcasts. What advice would you have for people in your position, Sage?
Yeah, my advice is rather simple, and it's two-pronged, so forgive me. My first piece of advice is just to not give up. I think once you decide that there's value in this, don't let anything deter you. Have that determination and grit to keep going, because once you do, it is rather seamless. Initially, there's a lot of hurdles to overcome, but once you get into the swing of it, it's rather seamless, and it just fits into your marketing funnel and strategy. And so just don't give up. The second piece of advice is, my guiding principle is really, would you want to listen to this? I think that's so simple, but it's important, right? Like, it can't be something that you yourself wouldn't want to listen to. You have to approach topics with new angles, fresh perspectives, interesting speakers. And so I would just always challenge people to think about that and use that as a guiding principle.
Excellent. Thank you. Dan, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, really take the time to think about the format development of the show, and don't rush into it, right? Really think about the audience that you want to reach. Who are they? Where are they? What do they want to hear? And what do we want them to do once they've listened to the podcast? That's super crucial. And with any client that we work with, we spend at least 6 weeks generally in format development, in that creative zone of really asking lots and lots of questions, getting that brain dump from many different perspectives within an organization to understand what they want this podcast to be, and really understand the persona of the listener. And that's super important, because that, if we get that right, that's going to give us the best chance of success for launch and getting the traction of the podcast with that audience. Because sadly, the world doesn't need another podcast, right? There are so many podcasts out there, but if we make a really, really good one specific to that niche audience, and we give people a reason to listen and keep them there because it's really good, then they'll come back for more, and you'll build that community, and they'll build that affinity with you. But don't be so quick to rush into it because everyone else is doing it. It's really got to be well thought out. And that's my biggest piece of advice.
Yeah, one of the things I tell a lot of organizations is making a podcast is not a binary decision. It's not whether you do or whether you don't. It's around what kind of podcast do you actually create? Because just like I mentioned earlier, 25 years ago, I was part of conversations where people were debating whether or not we should put things on the internet, and whether that was something we were really doing a lot of hand-wringing about. Not we, but my seniors, my people who would be my contemporaries by my age now. We're worried about whether we should do that. And really, when it comes to podcasting, being able to create an audio first, audio forward component that can connect with people in a screen-free and a screen-light way while they're in their kitchens and their cars on their commutes, it's really a valuable thing. So it's not a binary decision. Figure out what kind of podcast you want to have to be able to serve your audience in a way that's meaningful for them. So the last question is, where can people find you and reach out to you and follow your work? Sejal?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. My name on there is Sejal Patel. And please listen to Beyond the Bolus. I would not be doing my job if I didn't plug the podcast.
Excellent.
You have to do that. How about you, Dan?
Dan Cottrell on LinkedIn. I'm pretty findable on there. And thepodcastguys.co.uk, thepodcastguys.co.uk is where you can find more details about the company.
We will have links to that in the description of this session. If you're listening to this as a podcast or watching as a video after the event, we will also have this information in the notes there. Before we go, I also just want to mention one last thing about Insulet. They are a very innovative company. One of the things that I saw alongside when Dan was recording sessions at the ADA in Chicago just a few months ago, they also had the Marvel Diasonic character that they partnered with the Marvel organization, of which I and my oldest daughter are huge fans. And to see someone with type 1 diabetes using an insulin pump as a way to overcome fear and really fight the baddies in the Marvel universe was a wonderful illustration of the sort of outside the box thinking that you guys are doing. So thanks for all the work that you're doing there. Dan, thanks very much for organizing this and for all the work you're doing. Thank you both for being a part of Health Podcast Summit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.